The sea at Dan-no-ura does not forget. 800 years have passed since the tide turned and the Taira went into the water. 800 years since the child emperor was carried into the sea by his grandmother's arms. The sea does not forget. This is the story of a blind musician who played the music of that sea so perfectly that the dead came to listen. His name was Hoichi. He lived at a temple on the shore of the Strait, where the battle had ended, where the water still runs over whatever the water covered. He played the Biwa. He sang the Heike, and the Heike came to hear him. This story is the connection between everything that has come before in the long telling of Japan's great epic and the world that the epic left behind, the world where the dead are not entirely gone, where the story is not entirely finished, where the music that names them can still call them back. The Strait of Shimonoseki, the narrow passage of water between the western tip of Honshu and the northern coast of Kyushu, where the tides run fast and the currents are complex, and the water has a particular character that the people who live beside it have always known. This is not simple water. The Kanman Strait, as it is called now, is one of the most strategically significant passages of water in Japan. Ships pass through it between the Pacific and the Japan Sea. The city of Shimonoseki on the Honshu side and the city of Kitakyushu on the Kyushu side watch each other across the narrow gap. But before it was the Kanman Strait, before the cities, before the bridges and the tunnels that now connect the two shores, it was Dan-no-ura, the place where the Genpei War ended, where the tide turned, where the child emperor went into the sea. The water that flows through the strait today is the water that received everything. The battle gave it. The current that runs toward the Pacific is the same current that was running on the 24th day of the 4th month of the year 1185. The same water, 800 years of tides since then, but the same water, and somewhere under it, the sword, the sacred sword that no one recovered, that is still there. The Amidaji Temple on the shore of the strait in the town called Akamagaseki, which is now the city of Shimonoseki, there was a temple, the Amidaji, the temple of Amida Buddha, founded in 1191, 6 years after the battle, by imperial command to serve the dead. The dead were specific: the child emperor and Toku, the Taira warriors, the ladies in waiting, the grandmother, who had held the child and stepped off the ship, the temple was built to pray for them, to house their memorial tablets, to maintain the connection between the living and the dead that the Buddhist tradition understands as the responsibility of those who remain. The temple is gone now. In the Meiji period, when the government separated the Buddhist institutions from the Shinto ones, the Amidaji was dissolved, and the site became the Akama Shrine, the Akama-gu, which still stands today at the edge of the Strait, Dragon Palace style gate, vivid red against the water, the graves of the Taira in the courtyard, the small hall where the statue of Hoichi stands. But in the time of the story, it was the Amidaji, the temple of the dead, the place that existed to remember what the water received, and in that temple lived Hoichi. Hoichi, born blind, poor, gifted, these three facts are the beginning of every version of the story, because they are the three facts that explain everything else. The blindness first. In Heian and medieval Japan, blindness was not only a disability, it was also a calling. The blind musicians, the Biwa Hoshi, the blind monks who carried the stories of Japan on their backs and sang them in temples and households across the country, occupied a specific role. In the culture, they were the ones who remembered. Sightless, they developed the other senses to the point where memory and hearing and the awareness of the unseen became extraordinary. Hoichi was this kind of person. He had grown up with the Biwa. He had studied until the instrument was an extension of himself, until the music came from somewhere deeper than technique, until the songs he sang carried what the songs required, the grief, the beauty, the specific weight of 800 years of something that could not be put down. His specialty was the Heike, specifically the Dan-no-ura, the final battle, the chapter that the tradition says was so perfectly rendered by Hoichi that even the demons wept. He played the music of the dead. To the living, he sang their stories. He kept them present in the world. This is why the dead came. The first night, the head priest of the Amidaji had gone out, a funeral in the household of a parishioner, the kind of absence that leaves the temple with fewer people than usual, that creates the particular quiet of an institution minus its center. Hoichi was alone. It was summer, the hot summer of the Strait, when the air comes off the water, heavy and still, and the night offers only a slightly cooler version of the day's heat. He was sitting on the veranda, playing to himself, or playing for the night, for the water, for whatever listens, when there is no human audience. Someone came, not through the gate, not announced, just a presence, the sound of armor, the particular sound of the heavy high-end plate armor, moving the sound Hoichi knew from the music he had spent his life playing, the sound of what the Heike described, a voice, deep, formal, the language of a warrior from another century. My lord wishes to hear. The Heike, you are invited. Come. Hoichi stood. He did not ask who was speaking. He did not ask where he was going. He was a musician, someone of importance, wanted to hear his art. He went. This is the quality of the story. That is also a truth about artists and their work. The music calls and the musician follows toward whatever is listening. The palace. He was led through the dark. The warrior's hand on his arm, guiding him through what felt like a long gate, a broad courtyard, steps ascending, the sound of his feet changing from the sound of stone to the sound of wood, and then people, many people, the sound of them surrounding him on all sides, the specific sound of a great gathering, rustling silk, the clink of metal, the murmur of many voices that fell quiet as he was placed in the center of the room. He could not see it, but he felt it, the quality of a space that holds many people, of importance that has the particular weight of the assembled court, the atmosphere of expectation and attention directed toward him. He tuned the Biwa. He found the strings. He began. The Dan-no-ura, from the gathering of the fleets to the first arrows, from the first arrows to the turning of the tide, from the tide's turning to the end. He played everything. The grandmother and the child, Tomomori and the weight, the sword and the sea. He played it all to the room full of people who were crying. He could hear the crying. He had made audiences cry before, but not like this, not with this quality of grief, the grief of people who are not moved by art, but are moved by memory. He played for hours. Dawn was approaching. When they finally released him, he went back to the temple. He did not know where he had been. The priest discovered him. The head priest returned to the temple and noticed Hoichi's absence in the night. When Hoichi came back before dawn, exhausted, saying little, the priest questioned him. Hoichi said nothing at first. He had been told to keep it secret, but the priest pressed, and Hoichi told what he knew. A warrior came. A great lord wished to hear the Heike. He had performed. He would go again tonight. The priest sent servants to follow him. The next night, when the warrior came again, and Hoichi followed, the servants followed too. They followed him, out of the temple gate, into the street, through the dark, and came to a stop at the edge of the temple's outer grounds. Hoichi was not at a palace. He was sitting in the graveyard, among the tombstones of the Taira, playing his biwa to the graves, alone, the only sound, the music, and the faint light that the servants saw, hovering around him, the strange cold light that the Japanese tradition associates with the presence of the dead. They called to him. He could not hear them. He was somewhere else. The music had taken him into the other world, while his body sat in the cemetery. They pulled him away. They brought him back to the temple. They told the priest. The Sutra. The head priest understood what was happening. Hoichi had been claimed by the Taira dead. The ghosts of the battle had found in him the person who sang them best, who knew their story, as no one living knew it, and they were pulling him toward the world of the dead through the medium of the music that connected them. This was dangerous. The person pulled into the dead world by the dead does not always return. The tradition is full of accounts of people who followed the invitation of the ghost and did not come back, or came back wrong, or came back only partly. The priest needed to protect Hoichi. He called for brushes. He called for ink. He had Hoichi sit very still, and he wrote the Heart Sutra on every surface of Hoichi's body, not on his robes, on his skin. The characters of the sutra, written small and close, covering the face and the neck, and the chest and the arms, and the legs and the feet, the written sutra as armor, the sacred text as the boundary between the living and what the dead can reach. When you are covered in the Heart Sutra, the priest explained, you become invisible to the spirits. They cannot see you. They cannot claim you. The text creates a body that the dead do not recognize. He wrote until Hoichi was covered from head to foot, and then he forgot the ears. The third night, the warrior came again. Hoichi was sitting in the temple, covered in the sutra, told not to speak, told not to move, told to stay absolutely still, no matter what happened. The warrior walked in. He called for Hoichi. No answer. He called again. Nothing. He moved through the temple, looking. He could not find Hoichi. The sutra had done its work. The body covered in the sacred text was invisible to the spirit. Hoichi was there. The warrior was there. Between them, the text. but the ears. The priest had forgotten to write the sutra on Hoichi's ears, and the warrior saw them, 2 ears floating in the air where no body was visible, 2 ears, the only surfaces that the sutra had not covered. The warrior's voice, cool, practical, the voice of someone solving a problem. He said, "There is no Hoichi here, but these ears are here. I will take them back as proof that I came," and he took them. Hoichi made no sound. He had been told, "Do not speak, no matter what." He kept to the instruction. In the silence and the darkness, in the excruciating specificity of what was happening, he did not speak. The warrior left. Hoichi sat in the pool of blood, where his ears had been, until the priest came at dawn and found what the night had cost. After the priest came at dawn, he found Hoichi. He found what was missing. He wept. He wept for the oversight that had cost the musician his ears. He had done everything right and forgotten one thing. The one thing had been enough for the dead to reach through. He called for a doctor. He arranged for care. He sat with Hoichi through the recovery from the wounds that no doctor had treated before. And the dead did not come again. The warrior who had taken the ears had brought back his proof. The requirement had been met. Whatever the dead were asking of Hoichi had been asked. The connection was broken. Hoichi healed. The story spread. The story of the blind musician who had played for the dead and paid the price of the one oversight in the protection that had been arranged for him. The story spread the way stories about artists spread, with the quality of the particular, the specific detail that makes the general truth visible. He had played so perfectly that even the dead could not stay away. He had paid for it with his ears, and without his ears, he could still hear. He could still play. He could still sing the Heike in the temple by the shore of the Strait where the Heike ended. Hoichi the Earless, the name that followed him for the rest of his life, not as an insult, as a fact, and eventually as a mark of honor. The world understood what had happened. The story circulated through the region and beyond, carried by the travelers who passed through Akama, the merchants and the pilgrims, and the wanderers, who were the transmission system for the stories of medieval Japan. A blind musician had played for the dead. The dead had not been satisfied to listen once. They had come back for more. The priest had protected him with the Sutra, but had forgotten the ears. The dead had taken what was unprotected. This story was understood as a story about art, about what happens when the art is good enough to cross the boundary between the living and the dead, about what that crossing costs, about the particular risk of the artist who makes work that calls things toward it that might be better left undisturbed. Hoichi's reputation grew after the story spread. The artist, who had played for the Taira dead, became the most famous musician in the region. The lords and the priests and the aristocrats sent for him. He played. He had always played. He would play for the rest of his life, earless, but hearing still. Lafcadio Hearn, the man who gave the story its most famous form. Patrizio Lafcadio Tessima Carlos Hearn, born in 1850 on the Greek island of Lafcadia to an Irish father and a Greek mother, raised in Ireland and England, a wanderer through the margins of the Victorian world before he arrived in Japan in 1890 and found there what he had been looking for, a country that was still itself. He came to Japan in the last decade of the 19th century, when the Meiji transformation was in full force, when Japan was rapidly becoming something new and trying to hold on in the process to something old. He was entranced by the old, by the ghost stories, by the folk beliefs, by the specific quality of a culture that took its dead seriously, that maintained the connection between the living and the departed as a daily practice, not as a special event. He married a Japanese woman, Koizumi Setsu, took a Japanese name, Koizumi Yakumo, became a Japanese citizen. He listened, he wrote, his wife told him the stories. She knew, told them in the way. She had learned them, and he received them, and worked them into the forms that the English language could hold. The story of Hoichi came to him through Setsu from a collection published in 1782. She told it from memory. He wrote it down. In 1904, in the collection called Kwaidan, the story went into the world in English and has been there ever since. Kwaidan, the collection, the word itself, kaidan, in modern Japanese. Strange tales, ghost stories, the genre of the Japanese uncanny that the tradition had been building since the Heian period. Hearn assembled 14 stories for the collection, stories from the tradition, stories told to him, stories he found in old texts and reimagined in English. The first story in the collection is Hoichi the Earless. He chose to open with it, the story of the blind musician and the Taira dead is the first thing a reader of Kwaidan encounters. Why first? Because it contains everything. The Heike, the story that Japan had been telling about itself for 700 years when Hearn arrived. The dead, the Taira, the specific dead of a specific battle, still present, still haunting, still needing something from the living, the artist, Hoichi, the musician who went where the music took him without asking what was on the other side, the protection, the sutra, the text as armor, the sacred writing as the boundary between what the living can manage and what they cannot, and the oversight, the one forgotten surface, the ears. This is the detail that Hearn understood as the heart of the story, that the protection was almost complete. That almost is exactly what the story requires, that the gap between complete protection and almost complete protection is where the story lives. The Heike and the Ghost. We have told the tale of the Heike in 3 parts: the court, the battles, the quiet of Ohara, and now the ghost. The Heike does not end when the telling ends. The tradition understood this from the beginning. The Biwa Hoshi who carried the story were not only entertainers, they were priests of the dead. The performance of the Heike was simultaneously the telling of the story and the prayer for those the story named. When the Biwa monk sang the Dan-no-ura, he was keeping the dead present, keeping them remembered, keeping open the channel of attention between the living and the departed, that the Buddhist tradition understands as necessary for the peace of both. The Heike's dead were not peacefully resting. The tradition knew this. The 7 mounds at the Amidaji temple, the Nanabori-zuka, collected the memorial tablets of the Taira warriors, Taira no Norimori, Taira no Michimori, Taira no Tomonori, Taira no Noritsune, Taira no Tsunemori, Taira no Kiyotsunei, Taira no Tokiko. They were there, in the ground, near the water, and after Dan-no-ura, the ships in the Strait suffered unusual accidents. The sea was rougher than expected. Strange lights appeared. The tradition said, the Taira are restless. The temple was built to soothe them. The music was performed to honor them. Hoichi sang to keep them still. The Biwa Hoshi, the blind monks who carried the Heike. We have met them before in the telling of the 3 parts. The itinerant performers who walked the roads of Japan with the story on their backs, who performed it in temples and in aristocratic households and in the homes of ordinary people. who gave them a meal and a night's shelter in exchange for the particular gift the Biwa monks carried. The tradition of the Biwa Hoshi began, according to the tradition, when a monk named Kakuichi produced the definitive version of the Heike text. In 1371, the Kakuichi Bon, the version that became the standard, the version that most of the world knows when it knows the Heike. Kakuichi was blind. He was a Biwa monk. He assembled the text from the versions that had been circulating for 150 years and gave it the form that the tradition preserved. After Kakuichi, the Ichikata school maintained the tradition of the Biwa Hoshi, the formal, organized institution of the blind musicians who carried and performed the Heike. They had rules, they had ranks, they had a system for maintaining and passing on the specific musical and textual tradition of the performance. Hoichi, in the story, is at the edge of this tradition. The individual musician, the solitary practitioner, the one whose gift is too large for the institution to contain, and who goes where the music leads. The Heart Sutra, Hanya Shing Yu, the short sutra that the priest wrote on every surface of Hoichi's body, 260 characters, in the Chinese form that Japanese Buddhism uses, the condensed essence of the Prajnaparamita, the wisdom literature of the Mahayana tradition, distilled into a form short enough to memorize, dense enough to contain the core of the teaching. Form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. The Heart Sutra teaches the non-substantial nature of all phenomena, the absence of a permanent self, the interdependence of all things. It is recited in temples across East Asia. Every morning, it is the sutra of the funeral, of the memorial, of the ceremonies that maintain the connection between the living and the dead. Written on the body, it becomes the body's armor. The priest who wrote it on Hoichi understood something that the sutra itself teaches, that the text is not only meaning, it is also presence. The written characters carry the teaching in their physical form, as well as their semantic content. The ink on the skin is the teaching made flesh, the boundary between the living body and the world that surrounds it. He wrote everywhere. He covered everything. He forgot the ears, two small surfaces, two small failures, the gap through which the dead reached in. The Akama shrine today, in Shimonoseki, at the edge of the Strait, the red gate of the Akama-gu rises against the water. The shrine was built in the style of a Ryugu-jo, a dragon palace, the mythical underwater castle of Japanese legend. The gate is vivid red. The water is behind it. The strait runs fast outside. Inside the gate, the grave mounds of the Taira, the Nanaborizuka, 7 mounds in a row, each with its stone marker, bearing the name of the warrior interred. They have been here for 800 years. The names are still legible. The mounds are still tended. People come and bow. People come and leave small offerings. The tradition of maintenance continues. To the side of the grave mounds, the Hoichi-do, the Hall of Hoichi, a small structure housing the statue of Hoichi, a blind man with his Biwa carved in wood, sitting in the posture of the player, about to begin. He has no ears. The statue shows what the story left. Every year in July, on the 15th, a festival is held, the Miminashi Hoichi Matsuri, the Earless Hoichi Festival. A Biwa player performs the traditional music that Hoichi played is played again in the temple compound where the story happened. The dead are invited. The music is offered. The connection between the performance and the listening is maintained. One more year. What does the story mean? Like all the best ghost stories, it means several things at once. The most obvious meaning: be careful what you are good at. The gift that makes you valuable to the living makes you valuable to the dead too. The art that crosses the boundary between what the living feel and what is beyond words can also cross the boundary between the living and the dead. The musician who plays for the living plays for the dead as well. Hoichi played too well. His perfection was exactly the problem. A deeper meaning: the dead have claims. The Taira dead at the bottom of the strait were not at peace. They had died violently in a lost cause, far from home. The child emperor had gone down. With them, something was unfinished. They needed the story told. They needed to be remembered in the form that only Hoichi could give. Their claim on him was not malice, it was need. The need of the dead to be acknowledged, to be present in the memory of the living, to have the story told. That keeps them from the silence of the forgotten. The deepest meaning: art is contact with what we cannot see. The musician who plays at the edge of human experience is playing at the edge of the other world. The poet who names the grief that cannot otherwise be named is speaking to the dead as well as the living. The storyteller who tells the story of those who died is performing a memorial, whether they know it or not. Hoichi knew it. That is why the dead came. the ghost story tradition, kaidan. Japan has one of the richest ghost story traditions in the world, not because Japan is darker or more morbid than other cultures, but because the Japanese tradition has maintained more consistently than most the understanding that the dead are still present. The Obon Festival, the 3 days in August, when the dead return, when the family prepares the house, lights the lanterns, welcomes back the ancestors who come to visit, when the food is laid out for the dead and the living eat with them, when the fires are lit at the gate to guide them in, and lit again at the end to guide them back. This is not metaphor. The tradition means it. The ancestors come. The dead are present. The boundary that separates the world of the living from the world of the dead is not absolute. It is permeable. On certain days, in certain places, with certain music, the boundary opens. Hoichi's story is set at the most permeable of places, the gravesite of the violently dead, the people who died at Dan-no-ura, died in the worst possible circumstances for the peace of the dead, suddenly, violently, in a lost cause, without the rites that would ease the crossing. The Amidaji was built precisely because these dead were not settling. The shrine, the grave mounds, the music, the annual festival, all of these are the living world, doing what the living world can do for the dead who cannot fully leave. The film. In 1964, the Japanese director Masaki Kobayashi made a film called Kwaidan, an anthology film, 4 stories from Hearn's collection. The first story, Hoichi the Earless. The film is famous for what it does with color. The scenes of the real world are shot in naturalistic light. The scenes of the other world, the palace of the Taira dead, are shot against painted backdrops, deliberately artificial, deliberately theatrical, in colors that do not exist in the natural world, a sky that is neither day nor night, but a specific deep blue. That means the world of the dead, a courtyard of painted stone, a palace of 2 dimensions that is clearly a representation rather than a place. This choice is the film's insight. The world of the dead is not a darker version of our world. It is a different world with different rules in which the normal marks of depth and reality do not apply. The painted sky says, you are not in the living world anymore. The rules are different here. The dead audience, sitting in painted robes, on painted floors, in a palace that exists only as a surface. They are here. They are listening, but they are not the living listening. The film won the jury prize. at the Cannes Film Festival in 1965. It is considered one of the great Japanese films of the century. Hoichi has been in the world's imagination since 1904, when Hearn published Kwaidan. Since 1964, he has been in its eyes too. The music of the dead. What was Hoichi playing? In the graveyard? Not the abstract Heike, not the text as text, the specific embodied performance of the Biwa tradition, the music that the Kakuichi text was designed to be sung to, with the specific melodic patterns that the Ichikata school had developed for each section, each character, each emotional register. The Dan-no-ura section has its own musical character. The tradition identifies different modes, different tempos, different patterns for the battle narrative, the laments, the descriptions of the sea, the moment when the tide turns, a specific musical figure, the moment when the grandmother steps off the ship, a different figure. These are not choices the performer makes on the night. They are the tradition's choices, refined over centuries, the accumulated understanding of how this story sounds at each of its turns. Hoichi played all of this to an audience that had lived through it. Imagine playing the music of a battle to the people who fought in it. Imagine the quality of listening that an audience brings when the story is their story, when the grief in the music is their grief, when the names in the narrative are the names of people they loved. This is what Hoichi was doing. In the graveyard, the dead were not listening to a performance. They were listening to their own lives. Blindness and sight, the tradition of the blind artist, runs through Japanese culture with a specific understanding. The person who cannot see the visible sees the invisible. The Biwa Hoshi were blind, not despite their role as keepers of the tradition, but partly because of it. The blind person who cannot navigate by the usual landmarks develops a different navigation, a different relationship to the world around them, a different awareness of what is present that the sighted person can see past. Hoichi could not see the graveyard he was sitting in. He could not see the grave mounds around him. He could not see that the great hall he believed himself in was a cemetery lit by the cold light of the dead's attention. But he could feel the room. He could feel the quality of the listening, which was unlike any listening he had experienced from the living, the absolute stillness, the total attention, the grief that was not, the grief of people moved by art, but the grief of people moved by memory. He knew something was different. He did not know what. The priest knew. The tradition knew. But Hoichi, in the middle of the performance, blind to the graves around him, feeling only the quality of the listening, knew only that he was playing to the most attentive audience he had ever encountered. The connection we have been with the Heike for a long time now. 3 parts, 300,000 characters, the court, the battles, the quiet, the bell that rang at the beginning, and the woman in the valley at the end, and now Hoichi. Hoichi is what happens when the story outlasts the people who lived it. The Kenraman Inn in Ohara was still alive. She was the living connection between the world of the Heike and the world that came after. But she died, and after her death, the Heike became entirely history, entirely past, entirely dependent on the telling. To be present, Hoichi is the telling. The Biwa monk who carries the Heike from one era to the next is the person who keeps the connection open, who keeps the dead from becoming merely past, who maintains the channel through which the living can still encounter what the dead experienced. Hoichi played so well that the channel became too open. The dead came through it instead of remaining on their side of the membrane. The story of Hoichi is the story of what the telling costs when the telling is perfect. Every version of the Heike that has ever been performed, every Biwa monk who walked the roads, every storyteller who sat in front of an audience and sang the Dan-no-ura was doing what Hoichi did. None of them lost their ears. Hoichi was special. The dead do not come for every performance, only the perfect ones. The night at the Strait. Picture it. The shore at Akamagaseki, the water of the Kanman Strait, moving fast in the dark, the lights of the opposite shore barely visible in the time before electricity, or visible only as the fires of the fishing boats anchored in the protected coves. The Amidaji Temple, its gate, its courtyard, the grave mounds in the specific darkness of a place that has been a graveyard long enough for the darkness to have a particular quality. And in the courtyard, a small figure, a blind man with a biwa across his lap, playing the music of the Dan-no-ura, rising into the night air, the specific melodic figures of the tradition for the section that describes the final battle. Around him, what he cannot see, the grave mounds, the stone markers, the particular cold light that the servants saw when they followed him, and the listening. 800 years ago, the water of this strait received everything: the child, the grandmother, the warriors, the sword. The music that Hoichi played reached down to them, reached through the water and the years and the boundary between the living and the dead, and they rose to hear it, the dead, listening to the music of their own ending, the music so perfect that it gave them back what the sea had taken, the moment of being heard, the moment of being named, the moment of being present in a living world that knew their story. The music still sounds, not in the graveyard, not in the cold light of the dead's attention, in the tradition, in the festival at the Akama shrine, every July, in the Biwa players, who still learn the Heike and perform it in the ancient modes and the ancient melodies, in the film, in the story, in every telling of the story of Hoichi that reaches someone who has not heard it before and hears in it the thing that has been preserved. For 800 years, the music is powerful enough to reach the dead. The story is powerful enough to keep the dead present. The telling is an act of memory and of mercy. Hoichi lost his ears. He kept his music. He kept his gift. He kept playing. And the dead did not come again. Whatever they needed from the performance had been given. The music had done what the music can do. It had held them, acknowledged them, kept them present long enough to be heard, and then let them go. The strait is outside the shrine. The water moves fast. The lights of Kitakyushu are visible on the other shore. The tide runs toward the Pacific, carrying whatever the water carries, as it has carried things since before the names of what it carries were known. The music is in the air of this place, and the dead are listening, not dangerously, not reaching through, but listening, as the dead listen when the living remember them correctly, with attention, with the specific music of acknowledgement, with the telling that keeps them from the silence of the forgotten. The restless dead, onryo, the category of the Japanese ghost that is driven by unfinished business, by strong emotion that could not be resolved in the lifetime by the particular energy of a person who died in a state that the world had not yet addressed. The Taira dead at Dan-no-ura are among the most famous, onryo in the tradition, not because they were villains. In the ghost story tradition, villainy is not what creates the restless ghost. Intensity creates it, the strength of the attachment, the force of the unfinished. The Taira died intensely, the child emperor, was 2 years old and had no understanding of what was happening when the sea received him, the grandmother, who chose for him what she had also chosen for herself, carried a grief beyond what the living can hold. The Taira died at the moment of the complete destruction of everything they had been, not just a battle lost, not just a clan defeated. The entire world they had made ended with them. The court, the ceremonies, the poetry, the music, the specific form of life that the Heian period had built around beauty, all of it went into the water with them. This kind of ending does not settle quickly. The intensity of the loss remains. The ghost haunts the place where the loss happened. The water over Dan-no-ura is the most haunted water in Japan, and on the shore, the temple, the grave mounds, the music, and once Hoichi. Sleep and the story. The ghost story tradition has always belonged to the night. In Japan, the Hyaku Monogatari Kaidan, the gathering of 100 ghost stories, was a specific ritual practice. 100 candles lit, one story told per candle, one candle extinguished after each story until the room was dark and the stories were done. The darkness at the end was the point. The accumulated telling of 100 ghost stories in the dark was an act of invitation. The darkness, the stories, and the willingness of the participants to stay in the room until the last light went out was the practice of meeting what lives in the dark without flinching. Hoichi's story is one story, not 100, but it holds the same understanding that the stories told in the dark, the music played at the edge of what the living can safely approach, the art that reaches into the other world and brings something back is the most honest art, the art that knows what it is dealing with, the art that does not pretend the dead are gone, the art that holds the door open just enough for the dead to be present without consuming the living who hold it. The night is the time of this art. The dark is its medium. Sleep is the small crossing that the body makes every night toward whatever is on the other side. Hoichi's music went before us. The dead came to hear it. Now the music is done. The dark is here. The crossing is yours. What was heard in the graveyard of the Amidaji on the nights when Hoichi played, the dead heard something they had not heard in the years since the battle, their story, told correctly with the music that belongs to it by the one person alive whose gift was equal to what the story required. The Heike had been circulating for 100 years. By the time of Hoichi, other musicians had sung it, other Biwa monks had carried it, but none of them had played it as Hoichi played it. The tradition says, even demons wept, even the dead could not stay away. This is the tradition's way of saying his performance achieved what art aspires to, what the art of the Biwa Hoshi was specifically designed to achieve, the full presence of the dead in the awareness of the living. The dead heard their story, told as it should be told. They heard the grief, honored as it should be honored. They heard the music that the tradition had developed specifically to carry the weight of what happened to them, and they wept, the dead who have already done their weeping, who have been in the ground for 100 years, wept again, because the music was right, because the telling was true, because someone still remembered and could give the memory a form that the ears of the dead could receive. Hoichi gave them this. He lost his ears doing it. He did not lose the gift. He played for the living, for the rest of his life, and the living came, as the dead had come, drawn by the quality of the music, by the particular truth that only this performance could carry. The dead were quieter after. The accidents in the strait diminished. The cold lights faded from the graveyard. They had been heard. That was what they needed, to be heard. The bell and the biwa. We have heard these sounds before. The bell of Gion Shoja at the opening of the Heike, the bell that says, all things are impermanent, that the powerful fall, that the beautiful fades, the biwa of the monks who carried the Heike, the instrument that gave the words, their musical form that carried the grief and the glory of the Taira through the centuries of telling. In the story of Hoichi, both are present. The bell of the Amidaji temple rang at dawn when the priest came to find Hoichi in the blood of his missing ears. The biwa was what Hoichi played in the graveyard, while the cold lights of the dead circled him. Bell and biwa, the sound of impermanence and the sound of memory, the mark of what passes and the art that keeps it present. The three parts of the Heike and the story of Hoichi are held together by these two sounds. The bell rang at the beginning of the Heike's world. It was ringing when Hoichi sat in the graveyard. It is ringing now in every temple in Japan, where the tradition continues, where the sutras are recited, and the dead are honored, and the art that keeps the connection open between the living and the departed is still being practiced. The biwa is quieter now. The tradition of the biwa Hoshi has thinned to almost nothing a few practitioners, a few temples, where the Heike is still performed in the old modes, but the story persists. The story always persists. The bell is still ringing. The dead are still there, and somewhere in the tradition, that Hoichi embodied the music that reaches them. The night and the music. The night is the time of the story, not because stories cannot be told in the day, but because the night changes the quality of listening. The day is full of the evidence that the world is solid, that the things we see are the things that are there, that the surface of the world is its total extent. The night removes this evidence. In the dark, the surface of the world becomes uncertain. What is in the corner of the room? What is outside the window? What is in the space between the known and the not yet seen? This is the space that Hoichi played into, and the dead came through the uncertainty that the night creates, through the gap between what the living can see and what is actually there. You are in the night now. The story has been told. The music has been played. The dead of Dan-no-ura have been acknowledged one more time in this telling, in whatever form the story takes, when it travels through the air and arrives in your ears. They are quiet now. The cold lights are gone. The graveyard is still. The strait is dark, and the music that Hoichi played is dispersed into the night, where it belongs, where it has always belonged, where it will always be, in the air above the water, in the dark between the stars, in the particular silence that follows the perfect note. Let it carry you. Let the night carry you. Rest now.